I liked it as a kid, and I liked it for most time, but I'm about done with it. So anyway, 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12 is where I want to begin tonight. What we see here is we see a new king who's come to reign. And he makes a lot of mistakes that cause long-lasting effects. And so as you read, we're going to read chapter 12, verses 1 through 19. We're going to start that here in just a moment. But a lot of our Bibles, if you have any type of study Bible or something, you'll have a heading at the beginning of a paragraph or a section. What's some of your Bibles say at the beginning of this?
It says Rehoboam's folly.
What's that?
Rehoboam's folly.
Rehoboam's folly. Any others?
Rehoboam made king.
Rehoboam made king.
12:1, you said?
Mm-hmm.
The revolt.
There you go. That's what mine said. The revolt against. Yeah.
Mine says that on verse 16. Israel revolts against Jeroboam.
There you go. And it so it depends on where it puts the break. But sometimes those are study helps that are good. Sometimes they aren't. But it's going to apply to what we're talking about tonight. Does somebody want to read the first 4 verses of this chapter?
What was it again?
1 Kings 12, 1 through 4.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt. They sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore light the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you.
Okay. So what was the complaint?
Overloaded.
Yeah, they said we feel like we're overloaded, right? When you look at the Hebrew people when they're in Egypt, were they overloaded? They probably felt that way. And then what happened? As God blessed them, Pharaoh started to put more restraints on them and cause them to have to do more work or harder work, right? And then when they finally got relieved of that in the wilderness, what did they wish to do? They go back, right? They wish we could go back. And so, the question is, how bad was it? Does it have to do with perspective? Let's read verses 5 through 9. Anybody want to read that?
So he said to them, Depart for 3 days, then come random, consider the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, and he said, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will become your servants forever. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and insulted the young man who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer these people who have spoken to me, saying, Listen, lighten the yoke which your father has put on us.
Okay, so we see 2 perspectives. What are the 2 perspectives? Some people might say the wise and the foolish. What were the 2 perspectives?
One was keeping your help and the other one was driving it away.
Keeping your help. Okay. When I was thinking about this verse or these few verses, what I was thinking about was the phrase we use, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. What's that mean?
You get better results with sweet talking them instead of just telling them straight up.
Yeah,
If you're good to them, they're gonna stay with you.
that's right.
If not, they're gonna go.
You build loyalty, trust, confidence. There's several words that I see in this. In verse 7, he says, if you will be a what?
Servant.
Servant. What was Rehoboam's position? King. Ruler of the nation. Who did he follow? Solomon. A great and powerful, wealthy kingdom, right? Who was before him? Before Solomon? David. Was David a firm man? Yeah. But they talk about if you will be a servant to these people today, then you'll gain their trust and their confidence, right? And this is we look at the two types of people that are consulted. What is told about the two groups? One's old and one's young. When you see this, they're described as the ones who advised who? Now, that's interesting. Who was Solomon? The wisest king to ever reign. And he had older men that advised him. And so the word I thought about, or words, was peer pressure, right? Peers. It would have been one of Solomon's peers, right? Solomon was a wise man. He had wise men. They consulted with each other. And did Rehoboam like the advice? No, he didn't. And so he consulted with who? His peers, right? His peers. What did his peers tell him?
What do you want to hear?
What he wanted to hear, right? Somebody once said, sometimes this is the case, I've heard it, that you know what a second opinion is? Somebody telling you what you already know you should do, right? And sometimes that's a case. But in this instance, you have Rehoboam that goes to the elders, right? The wiser individuals, and asks them, what should we do? And do they give sound advice? How do we know it's sound advice? Well, because you keep reading the chapter. No. But how do we know it's wise advice?
Well, they've been around.
Somebody read Philippians 2, 5 through 8. Keep your finger here. We'll come back here. Philippians 2, 5 through 8.
Let this mind be in you, which also was in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross.
That's right. Here in verse 7, the old men say, if you will do what? Be a servant to them, right? Is there any better way to lead? How is Moses described? As a servant, wasn't he? He served the people all the way through the wilderness. How did he do it? A lot of times it was through serving God, but he was there for the people. So we come to verse 10. Let's read verses 10 and 11. Somebody want to jump in there?
Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges.
What do the young men say? They said, tell the people, they say, if you thought it was tough before, just wait. Right? Is that paraphrased? Is that what they meant? Yeah. Now, my Bible, as you begin the section, says the revolt against Rehoboam. That's right before verse 1. What's he doing? What's he going to do with the nation? He's going to drive them away. Let's keep reading. Let's read verses 12 through 15. Somebody read that, please.
So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had directed, saying, "Come back to me the third day." Then the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges." So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahai the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat.
Okay. What was the wisest thing from verse 1 all the way to here? There's two wise things that I perceive that Rehoboam did. What are those two wise things that he did? Did he answer the people directly? What- They sought counsel. What did he ask for? He said, "Give me time to make my decision." Is that a wise choice? You know, Peter's one that gets in trouble as far as our perspective. We talk about Peter and we say, boy, Peter, he was so hasty in saying things and doing things, right? And we say sometimes that was to his benefit, but sometimes what? Yes. Yes, sometimes he should have took a step back and said, "Give me 3 days to think about this," right? So that's one good thing that Rehoboam said. He said, "Give me 3 days so I can make a good decision." What's the other good thing that he did? Everybody knows. Just say it. Who did he go to? His father's counselors, right? His father had run a successful kingdom, hadn't he? And that's where he went first. But that's where his wisdom ended. Where did his wisdom end? When he went to his peers. Was there anything wrong with going to his peers? Not necessarily, right? But their perspective was wrong, wasn't it? They had the same perspective that he had. And sometimes when we go to someone that's older and wiser, that's in a different position, and we get their perspective, sometimes they don't have to be older, but sometimes they're just wiser too. But with their different perspective, you know, they've lived a long time. They said, "Listen, you know, my question is, did they think that the king had made it too difficult on the people? Had they talked to Solomon about that during his reign? I don't know, right? I don't know. But they said, this is how you can gain the kingdom's trust and keep them." Now, as we go through 16 through 19, somebody read that, please.
Now when all Israelites saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own houses, O David. So Israel departed to their tents, but
Rehoboam.
reigned over the children of Israel who dwelled in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent
Adoram.
Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore, King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in
Rebellion.
against the house of David to this day.
Verse 19 kind of sums it all up. Because of this one event, because of these bad decisions, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David until now, or to this day, right? They have long-lasting effects. Yeah, long-lasting effects. And so what I was thinking about, there's several things we could get from this account. One is to heed wise counsel, right? Does the Bible talk about heeding wise counsel? Yeah, several places. 1 Corinthians 1 is one of the great places. I like to go talk about that. But the other one is peer pressure, right? Peer pressure. And that's what I want to think about a little bit tonight. I knew we'd have our young people out here tonight. Was Rehoboam a grown man? Yeah, he was. Did he have a problem with peer pressure? Yeah. How many of us in this room don't currently have a problem with peer pressure? Or maybe if we were like this, how many in this room or who in this room is not affected by peer pressure? We've got all ages, don't we? But oftentimes it's something that we as younger people struggle with. Maybe I'm not as young anymore, but say we as young people. Right, Andy? We're young. What's that?
I'm still 12. I don't know.
They're still 12. I thought about Genesis chapter 3, and we won't go there. We'll move past this. But in Genesis chapter 3, then we have Satan comes and influences, right? What is that? It's a form of peer pressure, isn't it? And then Eve influences who? Her Adam, right? Peer pressure. And you think about what great danger there is in peer pressure. In fact, in Esther, and this came up yesterday when we were in Bible study on Thursday morning, we began a study of Esther. But in Esther 1, verses 17 and 18, and I'll go ahead and give the context before we read these verses. What happened was Queen Vashti had rebelled against the king. And the way she rebelled against the king was the king had a banquet for his lords and governors. And Vashti also had another banquet going on. And the king asked Vashti, his wife, to come and present herself at this banquet so that he could showcase her beauty to all his friends. And she refused to come to his party. And so what had happened was they were concerned about what people would think about the queen rebelling against the king. And so let's read verses 17 and 18. 1.
For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath.
Yeah. They say, what if people hear what specifically they're talking about the ladies, right? Well, if all the ladies in the kingdom are like Vashti and they rebel, what would you call that? What are we talking about? Peer pressure, right? Well, do we have to know somebody to be affected by them? No. You know, what are some things that affect us that we don't often think about as being peer pressure? We have anything in our life that affects us or alters our culture? What you see out in public, right? What you see out in public. What's some other things? Jobs, TV, movies, news, social media, right? You know, all that kind of stuff is a form of what? Peer pressure, right? We're affected by it. Okay. And so here there's like, what if the nation, they didn't have Facebook. They said, what if the nation finds out what Vashti did? We might have a whole revolution because of what she did. because of what? Peer pressure. Now, as we think about this, we ask the question, is peer pressure a good thing or a bad thing? Depends if it's good or bad, right? Holly said depends on how it's used. Okay? And that's the key. And so when we go to Acts chapter 1, which is where I want to go next, and here we have Rehoboam, not in Acts, but in 1 Kings where we started. In 1 Kings 12, we have Rehoboam, and he starts a revolt against himself because of his poor decision making, because he heeded unwise advice. But he heeded advice from his peers, his friends, right? And that caused a chain of events that, as the writer King says, it's still a problem to this day, right? All right, somebody read Acts chapter 1, verses 4 and 6. You can read 5 if you would like.
And being assembled together with them, he commanded them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, You have heard from me. For John truly baptized with water, but you shall be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now.
And 6. And 6.
Therefore, when they had come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?
All right. Verse 4 says what? Together. Verse 6, what do we see? Together. He was calling them to be together. Now, specifically, what was the purpose of them being together? Acts 2. They were waiting for something. But was it important that they were together while they were waiting? Yeah. Right? So they would be prepared. But as we come to Acts chapter 2, and after all these events that have been prophesied about for so long, as they transpire and they unfold, what we see is that how many were added to the church? About what from the beginning? About 3,000 souls. Somebody read verses 44 and 46.
And all that believed were together and had all things common. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart.
Okay. Several things we want to think about. All who believed. What were they? Peers, weren't they? All who believed. If they all believed, they would be a peer. What's a peer? What's that? You're equal, right? Of equal rank. That's the idea behind it, of equal rank. Okay. So we're talking about if someone has something in common. And we see that word here, together. And so what we're seeing is all who believed were together, and they had all things in what? Did they have everything in common? Were they all the same nationality? No. No. They all had the same trade? No. We talk about all the diversity that might have been among them. What did they have in common? What's that? Their belief, right? And also the principle we see in the early church, especially in Jerusalem, was they shared what they had with whoever needed it, right? All things were in common. Then as you look at verse 46, it says, so continuing daily in what accord? In one Honda. Right, that's what Richard Reinhardt. So what kind of car did the apostles drive? It was a Honda, because they're all in one accord. But anyway, I'll never forget that joke from him. Some people say it's not a joke because it's not funny, but I think it is. So continuing daily in one accord. What did they continue to do once they became peers? They banded together. They stuck together with one another. It says they're in one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and singleness or simplicity of heart, right? Right? What ties the church together? What makes us peers? When you think about the plan of salvation, what is it? Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. All those things, right? When we start to believe, and we saw that in verse 44, all who believed, right, were of one accord. What's the importance of Christians having peer pressure one with another? Yeah, it's great peer pressure. We need to encourage that type of peer pressure. In 1 Corinthians 5, the chapter there, we don't have time because I want to keep going, but we'll mention it. So for your notes, go look at that later on. For 1 Corinthians 5, what you have is a problem with a man who is a sinner, who is commonly accepted by the church, right? And what it was he was sinning, and the church says, that's all right, we're going to accept you anyway because we're so loving. And so Paul rebukes them, being inspired of God, rebukes the church. And the phrase there is that I want us to think about is a little leaven leavens what? A little lump, right? And so this individual who was in one accord with them, right? What was he doing? Was he affecting what they thought and believed? Was he changing their moral standard? Yeah. Yeah. And was he a member of the church? Was he a member of the church? He was accepted as one, right? And what's Paul tell them? To be careful of him and his influence, right? Even though he was a peer, be careful. And because a little leaven leavens a whole lump, so they were called to withdraw from him. 1 Corinthians 15:33, later on in the same letter, Paul says, be not deceived. Evil companionship corrupts good what? Morals. And part of that goes all the way back to what's being said in chapter 5, other places in the book also. But we've got to be careful and make sure that who we associate with is who we ought to be associating with, right? Pinocchio had a phrase, and what was his phrase he used? Let your conscience, or was it to Cricket said it? Cricket said to Pinocchio, he said, let your conscience be your guide. Huh. Is that a good thing? Yeah, the same thing that applies to our peers. Should we listen to our peers? If Rehoboam's peers were wise men, he should have listened to them. But were his peers wise men? No, they weren't. And so same idea, if our conscience is trained correctly. And so, as we're about out of time, John 12:41 and 42. And like I say, a lot of times we talk so much, how many youth rallies focus on peer pressure? Lots of youth rallies, right? Because we say you got to pick the right friends, because as young people, it's so important, right? But as older people, it's so important. And we see that principle here in John 12:42 and 43, because we see this, nevertheless, even among the rulers. If you were a ruler in Jerusalem in this time period, what would you have had to be? What's that? Pharisee? Okay, that's right, but you'd also have to be of what age? You wouldn't be young, would you? These would have been the elders, right? There would have been some of the elders, the older individuals. And so here we see this, that nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they would not what? So even some of the older, wiser, should be wiser individuals, because of their peers, right? Other rulers, the Pharisees here, they said, we won't confess him, lest what? Yeah, they lose their position, right? They lose their peers. And then verse 43 tells us what? What's that?
He wasn't persuaded.
Yeah, there.
Christian, probably because of where he was.
The peers. Yep. And you ask your question, what about Pilate? Pilate. You know, verse 43 tells us, for they loved what?
Praise men.
Yeah, more than the praise of God. They rather be accepted by what? Yeah, they'd rather be accepted by the world than by God. Is that a problem in the church today? You think about it. How many, and we can't put a number on it. We asked the question, I wonder how many members this congregation has lost because they love the praises of men more than the praises of God. What areas could that apply to? Lots of things, right? Lots of things. You know, say people say, well, I can't be at services because I've got to paint my house. My neighbor just painted the house. Now mine looks old, so I'll paint my house. So keep up with the Joneses. People say, well, I can't be there because I need to, you know, be a star employee at my job. Or, you know, you can apply it to so many things. But the key is what? Their peers. Because they're scared at what their peers will think of them. So anyway, that's what I was thinking about. Any questions or comments? Who's this applied to? Something we didn't have time to look at was there's two other things I'll give you for your notes. One is Joshua 24, 14 and 15. And because Joshua here, many of us are familiar with what's being said, but at the end of verse 15, he says, as for me and my what? Yeah. And in the verse and a half prior to that, what Joshua says is he basically cares. I don't care what you're going to do. You need to make your decision. You can follow the gods of Egypt. You can follow the gods of the people in whose land we dwell. But he says, as for me and my house, we're going to what? And when you go back and you see Joshua and Caleb coming back in Numbers chapter 13 with the 10 other spies, what did Joshua and Caleb say? They said, those guys are crazy. They don't know what they're talking about, right? And so Joshua is one that historically throughout his life always stood against what? Some people say, we could say for our study, say, well, he stood against his peers. But the thing is Joshua always was willing to stand against his peers when he knew it was standing against something that was right. Right? And the other thing that we didn't have time to look at was in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, we talk about the collection for the saints that's taken. Then in the second letter, in chapter 8, specifically verses 2 and 24, what we were going to look at was that Paul challenges the church to give like other churches have been giving, right? Positive peer pressure, but challenging them to do something right. Any questions or comments? All right. Thank you for your time.